My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 45 years old, and I hold the rank of colonel in the United States Army. But standing in the parking lot of the Riverside Community Center, that sweltering August afternoon, watching my entire extended family stream through the glass doors without so much as a backward glance, none of that seemed to matter. To them, I was still the disappointment. The black sheep. The daughter who chose combat boots over wedding shoes. Who picked a rifle over a rolling pin. Who dared to dream beyond the borders of our sleepy Ohio town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Mitchell family reunion banner hung crooked above the entrance, its red letters faded from 30 years of summer sun. I could hear the laughter spilling out through the open windows, the clatter of folding chairs, the familiar voices of aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years. My dress blues felt heavy in the humid air, each ribbon and medal a reminder of battles fought in places they couldn't pronounce, sacrifices they'd never understand. I wasn't supposed to be here. That much was clear from the moment I'd tried to RSVP 3 months ago. My mother's voice had been ice cold over the phone. Sarah, I think it's best if you sit this one out. You know how these things go. Family only. Family only. As if 22 years of military service had somehow erased my DNA. As if the blood I'd shed for strangers had diluted the blood that connected me to them. But I came anyway, because something inside me refused to be erased quietly. Something that had been building for months, ever since I'd discovered what they'd really thought of me all these years. Ever since I'd learned the truth about Uncle Bill's will, about the lies they'd told, about the money they thought I'd never miss because I was always playing soldier somewhere far away. I stood there watching David adjust his tie as he greeted the local bank president, watching Jessica pose for pictures with her perfectly dressed children, watching my parents beam with pride at the family they'd carefully curated. The family that apparently had no room for a decorated Army colonel who'd spent her life defending the very freedoms they took for granted. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that their carefully constructed narrative was about to crumble like dust. They had no idea that the failure they'd written off was about to remind them exactly who Sarah Mitchell really was. The rejection started early, so early I used to think it was normal. Picture this. Sunday dinners at 1247 Maple Avenue, the same oak table that had hosted 3 generations of Mitchells. My grandmother's china gleamed under the chandelier, and conversation flowed like honey around platters of pot roast and mashed potatoes. David would regale everyone with stories from his job at the insurance company, his voice confident and smooth. Jessica would show off her latest art projects, her delicate hands gesturing as she described color theory and brush techniques. And then there was me, 12 years old, sunburned from climbing trees, dirt still lodged under my fingernails despite scrubbing them raw. I'd try to join the conversation, to share something about the history book I'd been reading, or the model airplane I was building. But somehow, the moment I opened my mouth, the energy would shift. My father would glance at his watch. My mother would start clearing plates that weren't even empty yet. David would smirk and change the subject to something more appropriate. I learned to eat in silence, pushing green beans around my plate while the conversation swirled above my head like smoke I couldn't quite reach. The message was clear. Children should be seen and not heard, but girls like me shouldn't expect to be seen much either. School wasn't much better. While David excelled at debate team and student council, while Jessica won art competitions and talent shows, I gravitated toward things that made my parents flinch. I joined the Rifle Club, spent weekends at Civil War reenactments, devoured biographies of military leaders. When other girls my age were learning to curl their hair and apply lip gloss, I was teaching myself to read topographical maps and tie sailor's knots. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, was the first adult who ever really saw me. She had steel gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and she never once told me that my dreams were too big or too unconventional. When I told her I wanted to attend West Point, she didn't laugh. She didn't suggest I consider something more suitable like teaching or nursing. She handed me a stack of applications and said, "Then we better get to work." But when I brought home the acceptance letter, golden and official with the United States Military Academy seal embossed at the top, the reaction wasn't what I'd dreamed of during all those sleepless nights of studying. My mother set it down on the kitchen counter like it was contaminated. My father barely glanced at it before returning to his newspaper. David snorted and said, "Great, now I'll have to explain to people why our daughter thinks she's a man." The silence that followed was deafening. No congratulations, no pride. No acknowledgement that I'd accomplished something extraordinary, something that less than 15% of applicants ever achieved. Just the quiet understanding that I had once again chosen the wrong path, disappointed the wrong people, failed to be the daughter they'd wanted. I remember standing in that kitchen, the acceptance letter trembling in my hands, and feeling something inside me crystallize. Not anger, exactly, but a cold, hard determination. If they couldn't see my worth, I'd build it somewhere else. If they couldn't love who I was, I'd become someone impossible to ignore. The morning I left for West Point, my duffel bag packed with everything I owned, my mother hugged me goodbye with the same energy she'd used to embrace a distant cousin at a funeral. Polite. Necessary. Empty. My father shook my hand like he was meeting me for the first time. David and Jessica were conveniently absent, claiming prior commitments they'd somehow forgotten to mention. I walked away from that house with my chin up and my shoulders square, but inside, I felt hollow. 18 years old, and already an orphan, not because my parents were dead, but because I'd never really been alive to them in the first place. West Point changed me in ways I hadn't expected. Not just the physical transformation, though that was dramatic enough. The girl who'd left Riverside with soft hands and rounded shoulders returned 4 years later with muscles like iron and a bearing that commanded attention. But the deeper change was invisible, woven into my DNA during pre-dawn runs and midnight study sessions, and the crucible of belonging to something bigger than myself. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who understood that strength wasn't something to apologize for, that ambition wasn't unseemly in a woman, that wanting to serve your country was noble rather than naive. My classmates came from all corners of America, all backgrounds and beliefs, but we shared something fundamental, the conviction that some things were worth fighting for. I excelled in ways that surprised even me: military history, tactical planning, leadership exercises, subjects that had never been offered in the narrow curriculum of my childhood suddenly became the foundation of my identity. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, commissioned as a second lieutenant with specialty training in intelligence operations. The day of graduation, I saved 2 seats in the family section. I'd sent the invitation months in advance, had even called to confirm they'd received it. The ceremony was beautiful. Thousands of cadets in pristine dress gray, families cheering from packed Bleakins, the thunderous roar of the Air Force Thunderbirds overhead. When they called my name and I walked across that stage to receive my commission, I looked out into the crowd and saw those 2 empty seats like missing teeth in a smile. They hadn't come. Not my parents, not David or Jessica, not even my grandmother, who'd always claimed to be proud of me despite my, quote, unusual interests. I shook the superintendent's hand, accepted my diploma, and felt the weight of that absence more acutely than any pack I'd ever carried in training. But my sponsor family was there. The Hendersons, a military couple who'd volunteered to provide emotional support for cadets whose families couldn't or wouldn't participate in the West Point experience. Colonel Henderson, a gruff tank commander with kind eyes, had become more of a father to me in 4 years than my biological father had been in 18. His wife, Mary, a former Army nurse, had taught me things about resilience and grace that my mother never could. When the ceremony ended and families gathered for photos and celebrations, Mary Henderson put her arm around my shoulders and said, "We're so proud of you, sweetheart. You're going to do incredible things." And for the first time in years, I believed her. I sent photos home anyway. Professional shots of me in my dress blues, candid pictures from the graduation celebration, even a group photo with my sponsor family. I wrote a long letter describing the ceremony, the tradition, the honor of serving. I mailed it all with the same hope I'd been carrying since childhood, that this time this accomplishment would be enough to earn their recognition. The response came 2 weeks later. A postcard of Niagara Falls, where my parents had taken a vacation instead of attending my graduation. On the back, my mother had written in her careful cursive, "Glad everything went well. Hope you're happy. Love, Mom and Dad." 5 sentences, 23 words. That was the sum total of their reaction to one of the most important moments of my life. I kept that postcard in my desk drawer for years, not because I treasured it, but because it served as a reminder. A reminder that some people will never see you clearly, no matter how bright you shine. A reminder that you can't love someone into loving you back. A reminder that sometimes the family you need isn't the family you're born into. My first deployment was to Kosovo in 1999, barely a year after graduation. The Balkans were still smoldering with ethnic tensions, villages destroyed, families torn apart by hatred that ran deeper than blood. As an intelligence officer, my job was to analyze threat patterns, coordinate with local allies, and help keep the peace in a region that had forgotten what peace looked like. The work was challenging, dangerous, and meaningful in ways I'd never experienced. Every briefing I delivered, every threat I identified, every mission I planned, had the potential to save lives. Real lives, not abstract concepts from a textbook. When I helped coordinate the safe passage of refugees through hostile territory, when I identified weapons caches before they could be used against civilians, when I built relationships with local leaders who trusted me to keep my word, those moments gave me a sense of purpose that nothing in my childhood had ever provided. I was good at it. Better than good.
Preparar y narrar esta historia nos llevó mucho tiempo. Así que si te está gustando, suscríbete a nuestro canal, significa mucho para nosotros. Ahora volvamos a la historia.
My commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Santos, became my mentor and eventually my friend. She was everything I aspired to be. Brilliant, tough, compassionate, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to protecting the people under her command. She saw potential in me that I was still learning to see in myself. During my 6 months in Kosovo, I sent letters home every 2 weeks. Not emails, but actual handwritten letters on military stationery, sharing stories I was allowed to tell, describing the country and the people and the small victories that made the hardships worthwhile. I wrote about the children who would wave at our convoys, about the elderly woman who taught me to make traditional bread, about the interpreter who became like a brother to me. I never received a single reply. Not one. When I returned to the States, I found the letters I'd sent to my parents stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, opened but apparently unread, like bills that had been paid and filed away. The message was clear. Your life doesn't interest us. Your experiences don't matter. Your service is something we tolerate rather than celebrate. But the Army family I'd built filled that void in ways I hadn't expected. Colonel Santos recommended me for advanced training. My peers respected my judgment and sought my advice. The soldiers I led trusted me with their lives and their secrets and their fears about home. I was building something real, something valuable, something that belonged to me alone. My second deployment came 3 years later, Iraq, 2003, during the initial invasion. This time, I was a captain, with my own intelligence team, responsible for analyzing enemy movements and protecting coalition forces in the volatile region around Tikrit. The work was more intense, the stakes higher, the margin for error non-existent. I spent 13 months in the desert, in temperatures that reached 130 degrees, in conditions that tested every limit I thought I had. I learned to sleep through mortar attacks, to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information, to lead soldiers who were barely older than teenagers and scared out of their minds. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing to function when fear is the only rational response. My team prevented countless attacks, saved dozens of lives, and earned commendations that would follow me for the rest of my career. When I was promoted to major ahead of schedule, my commanding officer told me I had the potential to go all the way to the top, that leaders like me were exactly what the Army needed for the challenges ahead. I called home to share the news. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice distracted. I could hear the television in the background, could picture her folding laundry or organizing her kitchen, while I tried to explain what the promotion meant, what it represented in terms of trust and responsibility and recognition. "That's nice, dear," she said when I finished. "David got promoted too. Regional manager now. We're so proud." Then she changed the subject to Jessica's engagement, to the wedding plans, to the guest list that apparently didn't include anyone currently serving in a war zone. I hung up, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Not because David didn't deserve recognition for his achievements, but because in my mother's mind, selling insurance policies and analyzing enemy intelligence were apparently equivalent accomplishments. Because in her world, managing a regional office in Ohio was more impressive than leading soldiers in combat. That night, I sat in my trailer in the Iraqi desert, surrounded by maps and intelligence reports and the constant hum of generators, and I made a decision that would shape the rest of my career. I stopped calling home, I stopped writing letters, I stopped hoping for approval that would never come, and started building a life that didn't require their validation. The years that followed blurred together in the best possible way. Promotions came regularly, assignments grew more challenging, responsibilities expanded. I specialized in counterterrorism intelligence, worked with special operations forces, spent time at the Pentagon developing strategies for asymmetric warfare. I earned a master's degree in international relations, completed advanced leadership courses, built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the toughest assignments. My personal life remained deliberately simple. I had relationships, some serious, but nothing that survived the demands of my career. I had friends, but they were primarily military, people who understood why I might disappear for months at a time, why I couldn't always explain what I did for work, why service came first. I had a small apartment near whatever base I was assigned to, furnished with minimal personal items and maximum functionality. I sent birthday cards home, Christmas gifts, occasional photos. I maintained the fiction of family connection without expecting anything in return. When my grandmother died, during my third deployment, I was granted emergency leave to attend the funeral. I stood in the same church where I'd been baptized, wearing my dress uniform, listening to eulogies about a woman who'd been kind to me in the carefully limited way she'd been taught was appropriate. Afterward, at the reception in the church basement, David cornered me near the coffee station. He looked older, softer around the middle, with the satisfied expression of a man whose life had unfolded exactly as planned. "So, Sarah," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness. "Still playing army, as if the medals on my chest were toys, as if the soldiers I'd led were dolls, as if the enemies I'd faced were imaginary." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who shared my DNA but understood nothing about who I'd become. "Something like that," I said quietly, and walked away. That was the last real conversation I had with any of them for almost 8 years. I continued my career, continued growing and learning and serving. I was promoted to lieutenant colonel, then colonel. I commanded a battalion, managed million-dollar budgets, advised generals on strategic planning. I became exactly what I'd always intended to become, impossible to ignore. But they ignored me anyway, and somehow, that hurt more than all the rejection of my childhood combined. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 years ago. I was in my office at Fort Campbell, reviewing intelligence reports from Afghanistan, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was my father's, though it took me a moment to place it. He sounded older, uncertain, nothing like the confident patriarch who'd dismissed my dreams for so many years. "Sarah," he said, and I could hear him swallow hard. "I'm calling about Uncle Bill." Uncle Bill, my father's older brother, the only member of the extended family who'd ever seemed to see me clearly. He'd been a mechanic in town, never married, lived alone on a small farm outside Riverside, with more cats than any reasonable person should own. He'd always been kind to me in a quiet way, had never criticized my choices or suggested I should be someone different. "What about him?" I asked, though something in my father's tone already told me the answer. "He passed away yesterday. Heart attack. The funeral's this weekend." I felt the news settle in my chest like a stone. Uncle Bill, who'd taught me to change the oil in his old pickup truck, who'd let me help him fix tractors and water pumps and broken fence posts. Uncle Bill, who'd never once told me I was too much or not enough, who'd simply accepted me as I was. "I'll be there," I said. There was a pause. "Sarah, maybe it would be better if you didn't. You know how these things get complicated." How these things get complicated. Translation. Your presence makes people uncomfortable. Your uniform reminds everyone that you chose a different path. Your success is somehow an indictment of their limitations. "He was my uncle too," I said quietly. "I know, but..." "Well, you've been gone so long. You don't really know the family anymore. It might be awkward. Awkward? A decorated Army colonel attending her uncle's funeral might be awkward. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of exclusion, the careful way they'd learned to erase me without explicitly saying the words. I understand, I said, though I didn't. I'd never understand how love could be conditional on conformity, how family could be something you had to earn rather than something you belonged to by right. I didn't go to the funeral. I sent flowers instead, a simple arrangement with a card that read, "Thank you for seeing me. Love, Sarah." I never knew if they delivered the flowers or if anyone read the card. I never asked. What I didn't know then was that Uncle Bill had seen me more clearly than I'd realized. What I didn't know was that his quiet acceptance had been backed by actions I wouldn't discover until months later. What I didn't know was that he'd been protecting me in ways I'd never imagined. Ways that would change everything I thought I understood about my place in the Mitchell family tree. The discovery began innocently enough. I was preparing for what would become my final deployment, a year-long assignment to coordinate intelligence operations across 3 different bases in Afghanistan. The paperwork alone was staggering, and I'd taken a week of leave to organize my personal affairs, update my will, and ensure my finances were properly managed during my absence. I'd always been meticulous about money, partly because military pay required careful budgeting, but mostly because I'd learned early that financial independence was the only real security I'd ever have. No family safety net, no trust fund, no wealthy relatives to bail me out if things went wrong. Every dollar I earned, I'd earned myself, and every dollar I saved represented another step away from the girl who'd once sat silent at Sunday dinners. My checking account balance should have been predictable, steady. Military pay deposited like clockwork. Modest automatic investments, minimal expenses. I lived simply, traveled light, owned little beyond what could fit in a standard military footlocker. But when I logged into my banking app that Thursday morning, the numbers on the screen made no sense. Where there should have been months of accumulated savings, there was almost nothing. Where there should have been investment contributions building toward my retirement, there were gaps. Unexplained transfers, withdrawals I'd never authorized. The sick feeling in my stomach grew worse as I scrolled through statement after statement, watching my financial security evaporate in a trail of electronic transactions I didn't recognize. I called the bank's fraud department immediately, my military training kicking in with its emphasis on quick assessment and decisive action. The customer service representative was polite but unhelpful, walking me through security questions and promising an investigation that could take weeks. But I already knew this wasn't random identity theft or a banking error. The pattern was too deliberate, too systematic, too intimate. The transfers weren't scattered across multiple accounts or exotic offshore destinations. They were concentrated, methodical, flowing to a handful of familiar routing numbers. Numbers I recognized because I'd used them before, years ago, when I'd set up automatic bill pay to help my parents with mortgage payments during my father's brief unemployment. Numbers connected to accounts in Riverside, Ohio, accounts belonging to people who shared my last name. I spent the next 3 days reconstructing the theft, piecing together a financial crime that had been unfolding for years while I was deployed in places where internet access was limited and banking oversight was the last thing on my mind. The pattern was sophisticated, almost elegant in its simplicity. Small amounts at first, withdrawn during my overseas deployments when I was unlikely to notice or investigate. Then larger sums as they grew confident, as they realized I was too busy staying alive to monitor every transaction. They'd used my power of attorney documents, the legal paperwork I'd filed before my first deployment, to ensure someone could handle my affairs in case of emergency. Documents I'd signed in good faith, trusting that family meant something, that blood carried obligations of loyalty and care. Documents they'd manipulated to grant themselves access to accounts I'd worked decades to build. The total was staggering. Nearly $400,000, siphoned away over 8 years of deployments, carefully timed to coincide with periods when I was unreachable or focused on missions where financial concerns seemed trivial compared to survival. Money I'd saved for a house I'd never bought, for a retirement I was building dollar by dollar, for the security that came from knowing I could take care of myself no matter what happened. But the financial theft, devastating as it was wasn't the deepest wound. Worse was the realization of how they justified it to themselves, how they'd rationalize stealing from someone who was risking her life in service to their country. I found emails, careless digital conversations they'd never intended me to see, discussing my money as if it were somehow communal property, as if my absence made me less entitled to what I'd earned. David had used $30,000 to renovate his kitchen, joking in an email to Jessica that Sarah won't even notice. She lives in tents anyway. Jessica had taken $25,000 for her daughter's private school tuition, writing to my mother that it's not like she needs it for anything important. My parents had been the most systematic, treating my accounts like their personal emergency fund, withdrawing money for vacations, home improvements, investments in David's insurance business. In their minds, I wasn't really using the money anyway. I was off playing soldier, living on government housing, eating military food, with no real expenses or responsibilities. They'd convinced themselves that taking from me wasn't theft, but rather a kind of financial efficiency, redistributing resources from someone who didn't need them to family members who could put them to better use. The casual cruelty of their reasoning was breathtaking. Not only had they stolen my financial security, they'd done it while dismissing my entire life as frivolous, my service as a game, my sacrifices as meaningless. They'd reduced me to a bank account with legs, valuable only for what I could provide and absent enough to avoid inconvenient questions. I sat in my small apartment that evening, surrounded by printed bank statements and legal documents, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, though anger was certainly there. Something colder and more purposeful, something that recognized this moment as a turning point that would define the rest of my relationship with the people who'd raised me. I could have confronted them immediately, could have called and screamed and demanded explanations and apologies. I could have reported the theft and let law enforcement sort out the consequences. I could have walked away entirely, written them off as the cost of learning a hard lesson about trust and family. Instead, I did what the Army had trained me to do. I gathered intelligence, analyzed the situation, and developed a strategy. Because something told me this wasn't just about money. Something told me there were deeper secrets, older deceptions, patterns of behavior that went back further than I'd realized. Something told me that if I was patient, if I was thorough, the whole truth would reveal itself. I hired Rebecca Chen, a lawyer who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse. She was sharp, methodical, and had the kind of mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. When I showed her the evidence I'd compiled, she didn't express shock or sympathy. She simply asked, "What outcome do you want?" The question caught me off guard. What did I want? Justice seemed too abstract. Revenge too petty. What I wanted was the truth, all of it, laid out in irrefutable detail. What I wanted was accountability, not just for the money they'd stolen, but for the decades of dismissal and rejection that had made the theft possible. What I wanted was to never again be treated as if I didn't matter, as if my life and choices and sacrifices were somehow less valid than theirs. I want everything documented, I told her. Every transaction, every authorization, every lie they told themselves to justify it. And then I want them to face the consequences of what they've done. Rebecca nodded and opened her laptop. Then we're going to need help. The forensic accountant she recommended was James Rodriguez, a former military investigator who now worked corporate financial crimes. He had the patience to trace money through multiple accounts and the expertise to identify fraud patterns that would hold up in court. More importantly, he understood the particular betrayal of being stolen from by people who claimed to love you. We met in Rebecca's downtown office, a sterile conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Columbus. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass, casting long shadows across the table as James spread out his preliminary analysis. He'd been working on my case for 2 weeks, following digital breadcrumbs through a maze of transfers and withdrawals and investment accounts. This wasn't amateur hour, he said, adjusting his glasses as he pointed to a complex flowchart of financial transactions. Whoever set this up understood banking regulations, knew how to stay under reporting thresholds, knew how to time withdrawals to avoid detection. Someone did their homework. I studied the chart, recognizing my father's methodical nature in the careful planning, my brother's insurance background in the risk management strategies they'd employed. They'd approached stealing from me with the same attention to detail they'd have used for any other business venture, except this business was funded by my blood and sacrifice. The good news, Rebecca added, is that they left a clear paper trail. Every transaction is documented. Every authorization can be traced. The bad news is that some of this might be technically legal, depending on how broadly they interpreted your power of attorney documents. But not all of it, James said, highlighting specific transactions with a red pen. These withdrawals happened after your power of attorney expired. These transfers were made to accounts you never authorized. And these, he circled a cluster of transactions from the previous year, happened while you were in active combat zones, which could constitute a special category of financial abuse. I felt a grim satisfaction as the scope of their criminality became clear. They hadn't just betrayed my trust. They'd violated state and federal laws designed to protect service members from exactly this kind of exploitation. They'd stolen from me while I was dodging roadside bombs and coordinating missions to capture terrorists, taking advantage of my service to enrich themselves. But James had uncovered something else, something that transformed the entire landscape of the case. While tracing the flow of my money through various accounts, he'd discovered references to other assets, other accounts, other investments that I'd never heard of. Properties and bank accounts and legal documents that seemed to be connected to my family, but had somehow never been mentioned to me. Sarah? Rebecca said carefully, when did your Uncle Bill die? The question seemed to come from nowhere, disconnected from our discussion of financial fraud and legal remedies. But something in her tone told me the connection was important, that Uncle Bill's death was somehow relevant to the theft they'd perpetrated. 2 years ago, I said. Heart attack. I wasn't invited to the funeral. She exchanged a look with James, the kind of loaded glance that passes between professionals who've discovered something significant, but aren't quite sure how to explain it. We found something, James said slowly, something that might change everything you think you know about your family's financial situation. He slid a document across the table, a legal form with official seals and careful handwriting. At first glance, it looked like standard estate paperwork, the kind of document that accompanies any death in America. But as I read more carefully, as the words began to register, I felt the ground shift beneath my chair. It was a will. Uncle Bill's will, dated just 3 months before his death and notarized by a lawyer in Riverside I'd never heard of. But unlike the simple estate I'd imagined, a small farm and modest savings account, the assets listed in the document were substantial. The farm, yes, but also rental properties in town, investment accounts, life insurance policies, and a portfolio of stocks and bonds worth significantly more than anyone in my family had ever let on. And according to the will, all of it had been left to me. Not to my parents, not divided among the nieces and nephews, not distributed according to some complex family formula. Everything Uncle Bill had built over his 73 years of quiet living had been bequeathed to the niece, who'd been too busy serving her country to attend his funeral. But there was more. Attached to the will were copies of letters, handwritten notes in Uncle Bill's careful script, documenting conversations and decisions that painted a picture of family dysfunction I'd never fully understood. Letters expressing his disappointment in my parents' treatment of me, his anger at their financial manipulation, his determination to ensure I received what I deserved after years of being dismissed and excluded. He'd known about the theft. Somehow, Uncle Bill had discovered that my family was stealing from me, had documented their crimes, and had spent the last years of his life quietly building a case against them. He'd changed his will specifically to protect me, to ensure that at least one member of the Mitchell family recognized my worth and rewarded my service. The final letter was addressed to me personally, written in the shaky handwriting of a man who knew his time was running short. Sarah, it began, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally come to light. I'm sorry I couldn't do more while I was alive, sorry I couldn't protect you from their greed and small-mindedness. But I hope this helps you understand that not everyone in this family was blind to who you really are. I read the letter twice, my hands trembling slightly as the implications became clear. Uncle Bill hadn't just left me his assets. He'd left me evidence, documentation, a legal foundation for reclaiming everything they'd stolen and more. He'd spent his final years building a case against his own brother, accumulating proof of fraud and financial abuse that could send my parents to prison if I chose to pursue it. "There's something else," Rebecca said gently. "According to the public records, your uncle's estate was never properly probated. The will was filed with the court, but no one was notified, no beneficiaries were contacted. It's possible your family doesn't even know about this. It's also possible they do know," James added, "and they've been hoping you'd never find out. Some of the assets listed here have been generating income for the past 2 years. Income that should have been going to you but has apparently been redirected elsewhere." The scope of the deception was becoming clear. Not only had they stolen my savings while I was deployed, they'd concealed an inheritance that would have made me financially independent, that would have ensured I never had to worry about money again. They'd let me struggle as a single military officer, living paycheck to paycheck, budgeting carefully for every expense, while sitting on assets that belonged to me by right. But Uncle Bill had been smarter than they'd given him credit for. His lawyer had been instructed to file the will, but wait 2 years before taking any action, perhaps hoping the family would do the right thing voluntarily. When they didn't, when it became clear they intended to suppress the inheritance indefinitely, the lawyer had begun reaching out to me directly. That's how Rebecca and James had discovered the connection, through a legal notice that should have reached me months ago, but had been lost in the chaos of military mail forwarding. I sat in that conference room as the afternoon light faded, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and theft and deception that went back years, and felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. I felt protected, not by the family that had raised me, but by the uncle who'd seen clearly through their lies and manipulation, who'd used his final years to build a shield around me that would survive his death. Uncle Bill, the quiet mechanic who'd never married, who'd lived alone with his cats and his moral clarity, had given me more than financial security. He'd given me validation, proof that someone in my family had recognized my worth, had valued my service, had loved me enough to fight for me even when I wasn't there to fight for myself. The war was no longer just about recovering what they'd stolen. It was about honoring the man who'd died trying to protect me. About ensuring his final act of love wasn't wasted on family members who'd never deserved his loyalty in the first place. "What's our next move?" I asked Rebecca, and for the first time in months I felt like I had allies in this fight. "We're going to claim what's yours," she said. "All of it. And then we're going to make sure they understand exactly what they've lost." The confrontation I'd been planning for months finally happened on a gray Thursday morning in February. I drove the familiar route from Columbus to Riverside, past the same cornfields and farmhouses I'd seen as a child, past the billboard advertising David's insurance agency, past the church where I'd been baptized and confirmed and ultimately dismissed. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was returning home not as the prodigal daughter seeking reconciliation, but as a creditor collecting on debts they'd never intended to pay. I parked in the driveway of 1247 Maple Avenue, the same spot where I'd loaded my car for West Point 27 years earlier. The house looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier around the edges, with peeling paint on the shutters and winter-dead flower beds that spoke of declining attention to detail. But the BMW in the garage was new, as was the expensive patio furniture visible through the back gate. My money, I realized, had been funding their lifestyle improvements while I lived in base housing and drove a 10-year-old Honda. My mother answered the door wearing a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly uniform allowance. Her face cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been guilt before settling into the polite mask she'd perfected over decades of social obligations. "Sarah," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "we weren't expecting you." "I know," I replied, stepping past her into the living room without waiting for an invitation. The space had been redecorated since my last visit. All cream leather and brushed steel, the kind of modern aesthetic that screamed expensive interior designer. More of my money, transformed into cushions and coffee tables, and art that meant nothing to anyone. My father emerged from his study, still imposing at 72, his silver hair perfectly styled and his shirt pressed with military precision. David and Jessica materialized as if summoned, David still in his work clothes, Jessica clutching a coffee cup with manicured fingers. The whole family, assembled like defendants awaiting trial. I stood in the center of their renovated living room, wearing my dress blues with every ribbon and medal I'd earned over 2 decades of service, and felt the weight of the moments settle around us like fog. This was the family that had raised me, taught me to ride a bike and tie my shoes and say please and thank you. These were the people who'd driven me to school and helped with homework and celebrated birthdays with grocery store cake and off-key singing. They were also the people who'd systematically stolen nearly $500,000 from me while I was dodging bullets in foreign countries, who'd convinced themselves that my life was somehow less valuable than their comfort, who'd excluded me from family gatherings while spending money I'd earned through blood and sacrifice. "We need to talk," I said, my voice carrying the command authority I'd developed over years of leading soldiers in combat situations. "All of us, right now." The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken guilt and growing unease. They knew why I was here, had probably been expecting this moment since the first unauthorized withdrawal, but had convinced themselves it would never come. David shifted uncomfortably, his insurance salesman confidence wavering under the weight of my stare. Jessica set down her coffee cup with trembling fingers. My parents exchanged the kind of look that passes between co-conspirators when their scheme begins to unravel. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, the kind of documentation that Rebecca and James had prepared with military precision. Bank statements, legal analyses, forensic accounting reports, copies of every transaction they'd made using my money. The paper trail of their betrayal, organized and annotated and absolutely irrefutable. "I know about the money," I said simply, setting the folder on their expensive coffee table. "All of it. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every dollar you've stolen from me over the past 8 years. The reaction was immediate and telling. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. My mother's hand flew to her throat, a gesture of shock that seemed genuine despite her obvious guilt. David's face flushed red, the way it had when we were children, and he'd been caught in some mischief. Jessica just stared, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe the conversation was actually happening. "Sarah," my father began, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he'd used when I was a child asking inconvenient questions. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I replied, opening the folder and spreading documents across their table like evidence in a courtroom. David used $37,000 of my money to renovate his kitchen and buy a boat. Jessica took $28,000 for private school tuition and family vacations. You and Mom have withdrawn over $200,000 for privatization for home improvements, investments, and general living expenses. Each number hit them like a physical blow. Jessica actually gasped, as if hearing the amounts spoken aloud made the theft more real than it had been when they were just electronic transfers. David's face went from red to pale, the confident salesman replaced by a man who'd been caught in an unforgivable crime. "We weren't stealing," my mother said weakly, her voice lacking any conviction. "We were managing your finances. You were always deployed, always unreachable. We thought we were helping." "Helping?" I repeated, the word hanging in the air like smoke. "You thought you were helping by stealing my retirement savings while I was in combat zones. You thought you were helping by treating my bank account like your personal piggy bank. You thought you were helping by excluding me from family events while spending money I'd earned getting shot at by terrorists." The accusations landed with devastating precision because they were absolutely true, documented down to the penny by forensic accountants who specialized in financial crimes. There was no wiggle room, no plausible deniability, no way to spin theft into benevolence. "You don't understand," David said, his voice taking on the whining quality I remembered from childhood arguments. "You live on base, eat military food, don't have real expenses. You don't need money the way the rest of us do." The casual dismissal of my entire life was breathtaking in its cruelty. David, who'd never spent a day in uniform, who'd never missed a family dinner or birthday party or holiday celebration, somehow believed he was more entitled to the money I'd earned than I was. He'd reduced my service to a lifestyle choice, my sacrifice to a career convenience that somehow made me less deserving of financial security. "I don't need money," I said slowly, letting each word carry the weight of 27 years of military service. Because dodging roadside bombs and coordinating counterterrorism operations and leading soldiers in combat apparently doesn't count as real work in your mind. Jessica tried a different approach, appealing to family loyalty and shared history. "Sarah, we're family. Family helps each other out. It's not like we were strangers taking advantage of you. Family helps each other out." The phrase was particularly rich coming from someone who'd made it clear my entire adult life, that I wasn't really part of the family they'd constructed around shared values and acceptable life choices. Jessica, who'd never bothered to visit me on any base, who'd never acknowledged my promotions or commendations, who'd actively lobbied to exclude me from family gatherings, was now invoking family bonds to justify theft. Family, I repeated, pulling out another document from my briefcase. Let's talk about family, Jessica. Let's talk about Uncle Bill. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. My father went completely still, his face draining of color. My mother's hand moved to cover her mouth. David and Jessica looked confused, but my parents clearly understood the significance of Uncle Bill's name in this context. I unfolded the will slowly, deliberately, letting them see the official seals and legal language that would transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew about our family's financial situation. Uncle Bill's final testament, leaving his entire estate to the niece they'd spent decades dismissing and excluding. Did you know, I asked conversationally, that Uncle Bill left me everything? The farm, the rental properties, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies. $750,000 in assets that have been generating income for 2 years while I lived in a studio apartment and budgeted every grocery purchase. The silence was deafening. My parents stared at the will as if it were a venomous snake. Jessica's confusion gave way to something approaching panic, and David's insurance agent mind was clearly calculating the financial implications of what I'd just revealed. That's impossible, my mother whispered. Bill never had that kind of money. He was a mechanic. He lived alone on that old farm. Bill was smarter than any of you gave him credit for, I replied, producing more documents from Uncle Bill's estate file. He invested wisely, bought rental properties, saved consistently for 50 years. And he watched you people treat me like garbage for my entire adult life while I was serving my country. The letters came next. Uncle Bill's handwritten documentation of family conversations, his growing awareness of their financial theft, his disgust with their treatment of me. Evidence that someone in the Mitchell family had been paying attention, had been keeping score, had been planning for justice even when I was too busy surviving combat deployments to defend myself. He knew you were stealing from me, I continued, watching their faces as the full scope of Uncle Bill's knowledge became clear. He documented it, investigated it, and spent the last 2 years of his life making sure you'd face consequences for what you'd done. My father found his voice, though it came out as a croak. Sarah, we can explain. The money, the decisions we made, it was all done with the best intentions. Best intentions. The same phrase every criminal uses when they're caught. The same excuse every betrayer offers when their victims finally fight back. As if good intentions could transform theft into charity. As if family relationships could excuse criminal behavior. The best intentions, I said, standing and gathering the documents that had destroyed their comfortable narrative. Like the best intentions you had when you told people I couldn't attend Uncle Bill's funeral because it would be awkward. Like the best intentions you had when you convinced yourselves that my military service was just an extended game of dress-up. Like the best intentions you had when you decided my money belonged to the family members who'd actually stayed home and lived acceptable lives. Each phrase hit them like artillery fire, precise and devastating. They'd built their entire justification for theft on the foundation that I somehow mattered less, that my choices had somehow forfeited my right to be treated with basic respect and honesty. Now that foundation was crumbling, and they were left with the ugly truth of what they'd done and who they really were. What do you want? David asked, his salesman instincts finally kicking in as he recognized that this conversation was really a negotiation, that I held all the cards and they were completely at my mercy. What did I want? Justice, certainly. Accountability for decades of dismissal and theft. Recognition that their actions had consequences beyond their family's carefully constructed social facade. But more than that, I wanted them to understand what they'd lost, what they'd thrown away through their greed and small-mindedness, and inability to see past their own limited worldview. I want my money back, I said simply. All of it. Every dollar you've stolen, plus interest, plus the income from Uncle Bill's estate that should have been mine for the past 2 years. I want it transferred back to accounts under my control within 30 days. Sarah, that's not possible, my mother said desperately. We've spent the money. David's business, Jessica's children, the house improvements. We can't just write you a check for $500,000. Then you'll sell assets, I replied without sympathy. David can sell his boat and downsize his house. Jessica can take her children out of private school and get a job. You can mortgage this place and liquidate your retirement accounts. I don't care how you do it, but you're going to make me whole. The mathematical reality was sinking in. They'd spent years treating my money as their own, making financial decisions based on stolen assets, building lifestyles they couldn't actually afford. Now the bill was coming due, and they didn't have the resources to pay it without dismantling the comfortable existence they'd constructed with my sacrifice. And if we refuse? David asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. I smiled for the first time since entering their house, a cold expression that had nothing to do with warmth or family affection. Then I file criminal charges for theft from a deployed service member, which is a federal crime. I sue you for financial elder abuse, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I make sure everyone in this town knows exactly how the Mitchell family treats their decorated veteran daughter. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. They'd spent decades caring about their reputation, their standing in the community, their image as a successful and respectable family. The prospect of criminal charges and public humiliation was more terrifying to them than any physical danger they'd ever faced. You wouldn't, Jessica said, but her voice carried no conviction. Try me, I replied, closing my briefcase with a decisive snap. You have 30 days to make this right. After that, my lawyer files papers, and this becomes a very public legal matter that will destroy what's left of your reputation in this town. I walked toward the door, pausing only to deliver one final message, the coup de grace that would ensure they understood exactly what this conversation had cost them. By the way, I said, turning back to face the family that had raised me and betrayed me, and underestimated me for the last time. The annual Mitchell family reunion is in 6 months. I'll be attending this year. As the primary beneficiary of Uncle Bill's estate and the victim of your financial crimes, I think it's time the whole family learned the truth about who you really are. The look of absolute terror on their faces was worth every year of silence, every unanswered letter, every birthday card that had gone unacknowledged. They could steal my money, but they couldn't steal the reckoning that was coming. I left them sitting in their expensive living room, surrounded by furniture and decorations bought with my blood and sacrifice, and drove away knowing that the war had entered a new phase. The battle lines were drawn, the evidence was overwhelming, and justice was finally within reach. The girl who'd left for West Point 27 years earlier had been seeking their approval. The colonel who'd returned was no longer interested in what they thought. I was coming to collect what was mine, and I wasn't leaving Riverside empty-handed this time. The weeks leading up to the reunion moved with the deliberate pace of a military operation. Every detail mattered, every element had to be perfectly coordinated, every contingency needed advanced planning. This wasn't just about showing up to a family gathering. This was about orchestrating a moment of truth that would redefine 30 years of family dynamics in a single afternoon. My phone rang constantly during those weeks, desperate calls from various family members, trying to negotiate, to explain, to somehow find a middle ground that would allow them to keep their dignity while returning my money. David called twice, offering payment plans and partial restitution, his insurance salesman training kicking in, as he tried to structure a deal that would minimize their financial damage. Jessica sent long text messages filled with appeals to sisterly loyalty and memories of childhood closeness that had never actually existed. My parents were more direct in their desperation. My mother showed up at my apartment in Columbus unannounced, standing in my hallway with tears in her eyes and a checkbook in her trembling hands. She'd aged years in the weeks since our confrontation, her carefully maintained appearance cracking under the stress of impending exposure. "Please, Sarah," she'd begged, offering me a check for $50,000 as if that token gesture could somehow purchase my silence. "Think about the family. Think about your nieces and nephews. They don't deserve to be hurt by this." I'd looked at her standing there, this woman who'd raised me and fed me and taught me to tie my shoes, and felt nothing but cold disappointment. Even in her desperation, even facing the complete destruction of everything she'd built, She couldn't bring herself to acknowledge what she'd done wrong. It was still about protecting the family from consequences, still about managing the situation rather than accepting responsibility. "You should have thought about the family before you stole from me," I'd told her, closing the door without taking the check. My father's approach was more aggressive, more in keeping with his authoritarian personality. He called my commanding officer at Fort Campbell, trying to suggest that I was experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown that was affecting my judgment. He contacted my high school principal, my childhood pastor, anyone he could think of who might have influence over me or could be convinced to intervene on their behalf. But I wasn't the confused teenager who'd left Riverside decades earlier. I was a full colonel in the United States Army, with a spotless service record, and the respect of peers who'd watched me perform under pressure for over 2 decades. His desperate attempts to discredit me only served to highlight how thoroughly he'd misunderstood who I'd become. The most pathetic call came from David 3 days before the reunion. He'd been drinking, his voice slurred and defensive as he tried one last time to make me understand their perspective. "We raised you, Sarah," he'd said, his words heavy with alcohol and self-pity. "We fed you and clothed you and put a roof over your head for 18 years. Don't you think that entitles us to something? Don't you think we deserve some consideration for everything we did for you?" The audacity was breathtaking. In David's mind, basic parental obligations somehow created a debt that justified decades of theft and rejection. The food and shelter they'd provided as legal guardians had apparently purchased the right to treat me as a secondary family member whose achievements could be dismissed and whose money could be stolen without consequence. "You didn't raise me," I'd told him quietly. "You housed me. There's a difference." Through it all, Rebecca and James continued building our case with the methodical precision of experienced prosecutors. They'd uncovered additional financial irregularities, traced money through shell companies and fake investment accounts, documented a pattern of fraud that went back even further than we'd initially realized. The evidence was overwhelming, ironclad, the kind of case that district attorneys dream about. But more importantly, they'd helped me understand something crucial about timing and leverage. The reunion wasn't just a family gathering. It was a public event, witnessed by dozens of relatives and family friends who'd watched my parents build their reputation over decades. The exposure wouldn't just be personal. It would be social, professional, devastating in ways that went far beyond financial consequences. Rebecca had also made another discovery, one that transformed my understanding of Uncle Bill's final months. While researching the probate records, she'd found correspondence between Uncle Bill and his lawyer discussing not just the will, but specific instructions for its revelation. He'd known about the reunion, had planned for this exact scenario, had choreographed his posthumous intervention with the same attention to detail he'd once brought to rebuilding engines. "Your uncle was a smart man," Rebecca had told me, showing me the letters he'd written to his attorney. He knew that confronting them privately would just lead to denial and cover-up. He wanted the truth revealed publicly, witnessed by people who mattered to them, in a way that would make denial impossible. Uncle Bill, the quiet mechanic who'd lived alone with his moral clarity, had orchestrated one final act of protection that would outlive him by years. He'd turned his funeral arrangements into a legal strategy, his estate planning into a weapon for justice, his final wishes into a guarantee that I would never again be dismissed or ignored by the family that had failed to value me while he was alive. The morning of the reunion, I woke before dawn with the calm focus that had carried me through countless military operations. My dress uniform hung pressed and ready in my closet, every ribbon and medal positioned with precise attention to regulation standards. This wasn't vanity. It was armor. Every decoration represented a moment of service, a decision made under pressure, a life touched by my actions. Together they told the story of who I'd become, despite their limitations, not because of their support. I'd made arrangements that would have impressed my most meticulous operations sergeants. Marcus Thompson, my former classmate who now worked at the Pentagon, had coordinated leave for himself and 3 other officers who'd served under my command. They would arrive at the reunion not as protesters or enforcers, but as witnesses, colleagues who could speak to my character and achievements with first-hand knowledge. The legal documents were prepared in multiple copies, organized in folders that Rebecca had labeled with military precision. Uncle Bill's will, the forensic accounting reports, the evidence of financial theft, character statements from superior officers, documentation of my service record. Everything needed to transform speculation into irrefutable fact, to change a family dispute into a legal reckoning. I drove to Riverside through the same Ohio countryside I'd known as a child. Past farms where I'd learned to recognize the difference between corn and soybeans. Past the creek where I'd caught my first fish with Uncle Bill's patient guidance. The landscape held memories that belonged to a different person. A girl who'd believed that love was something you earned through conformity rather than something you deserved simply by existing. The Riverside Community Center looked exactly as I remembered it, from countless childhood events. The same brick building with windows that never quite closed properly. The same parking lot full of pickup trucks and sensible sedans. The same banner stretched across the entrance proclaiming the continuity of family traditions. But this year, tradition was about to collide with truth, in ways that would reshape everything these people believed about the Mitchell family legacy. I parked deliberately in the front row, my government plates visible to anyone who cared to notice. The car was modest, functional, nothing like the luxury vehicles that David and Jessica had purchased with my money. But it represented something more important than status. It represented choices made with integrity, a life built through honest work rather than family theft. As I walked toward the entrance, I could see familiar faces through the windows, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, family friends who remembered me as the odd daughter who'd chosen military service over marriage and motherhood. They were laughing, sharing photos of grandchildren, complaining about politics and weather, and the rising cost of everything. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their afternoon was about to be disrupted by revelations that would make some of them question everything they thought they knew about respectability and family values. My parents were holding court near the registration table, my father's booming voice carrying across the room as he told some story about his golf game, my mother distributing her famous potato salad and accepting compliments on her appearance. They looked confident, comfortable, like people who'd successfully navigated a minor crisis and emerged with their reputation intact. David was working the room with professional charm, shaking hands and asking about business opportunities, his insurance agent persona perfectly calibrated for small-town social dynamics. Jessica had positioned herself near the children's activities, photographing her perfectly dressed daughters, with the dedication of a professional publicist documenting her successful maternal performance. They all looked so normal, so respectable, so completely convinced that their version of reality was the only one that mattered. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. These people who'd spent years stealing from a deployed service member somehow maintained the self-image of moral, upstanding citizens who deserved respect and admiration from their community. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, feeling the weight of what was about to happen settle around me like familiar equipment. This was the moment Uncle Bill had planned for, the confrontation he'd engineered from beyond the grave, the reckoning that had been building for decades of dismissal and theft and casual cruelty disguised as family dynamics. Then I saw him, Marcus Thompson, walking through the side entrance with the bearing that marked him as unmistakably military even in civilian clothes. Behind him came Captain Lisa Park, Sergeant Major Tony Williams, and Major James Crawford, all of them people who'd served under my command or alongside me in various deployments. They'd taken leave, traveled from different bases, coordinated their arrival to provide exactly the kind of witness testimony that would make denial impossible. Marcus spotted me immediately, his face breaking into the kind of smile reserved for old friends who'd shared dangerous times and emerged stronger. He was older now, his hair graying at the temples, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd found his place in the world and made peace with the choices that had brought him there. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, approaching with the measured pace of someone who understood the significance of the moment. His voice carried just loud enough for nearby relatives to hear, the formal address cutting through the casual conversation like a blade. The reaction was immediate and electric. Heads turned, Conversations stopped, and suddenly I was the center of attention in a way that had nothing to do with family obligation or polite inclusion. These were my peers, my colleagues, people who knew me professionally and had chosen to spend their personal time honoring my service and character. "Marcus," I replied, returning his handshake with genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming, all of you." The other officers approached with similar formality, each greeting me with the respect due to a superior officer, each interaction witnessed by family members who were beginning to understand that their narrative about my military service might have been seriously incomplete. Captain Park mentioned my leadership during our deployment to Afghanistan. Sergeant Major Williams referenced my role in developing counterterrorism protocols that had saved countless lives. Major Crawford described my reputation at the Pentagon as someone whose strategic thinking was sought by senior leadership. Within minutes, the entire dynamic of the reunion had shifted. I wasn't the wayward daughter who'd chosen an unconventional path. I was a decorated military officer whose colleagues had traveled across the country to show their respect. I wasn't the family disappointment who'd rejected traditional roles. I was a leader whose professional achievements were being celebrated by people who understood their significance. My parents watched this transformation with growing unease, their confident social performance beginning to crack under the weight of evidence that maybe, just maybe, they'd seriously misjudged their daughter's value and achievements. David's insurance salesman's smile became strained as he realized that his dismissive comments about, quote, playing soldier might not land quite the same way with actual soldiers in the room. But this was just the opening move. The real revelation, Uncle Bill's final gift, was still to come. I caught Rebecca's eye as she entered through the main door, legal briefcase in hand, her professional appearance marking her as someone with official business that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. The game was about to change completely, and they had no idea what was coming. The moment arrived with the quiet inevitability of sunrise. Rebecca had positioned herself near the small stage where my cousin usually gave the annual family update, her briefcase resting on a nearby table like artillery waiting to be deployed. The room was full now, 3 generations of Mitchells and their extended network of friends and neighbors, all gathered for what they assumed would be another routine celebration of family continuity and shared values. My Aunt Margaret was in the middle of telling everyone about her grandson's college scholarship when Rebecca stepped forward, her professional demeanor commanding immediate attention. The conversations didn't stop all at once. They faded gradually, like waves receding from a beach, until the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant laughter of children playing outside. "Excuse me," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in courtrooms and boardrooms. "I have some important information to share regarding the estate of William Mitchell." Uncle Bill's name hung in the air like incense, sacred and solemn. The room went completely silent. Even the youngest children seemed to sense that something significant was happening, that the adults around them had suddenly focused their attention on matters beyond their understanding. My father stood up from his chair near the head table, his face already showing the strain of a man who suspected what was coming but hoped desperately to prevent it. "I don't think this is the appropriate time or place for legal matters," he said, trying to assert family authority over a situation that had already moved beyond his control. "Actually," Rebecca replied with the patience of someone who'd anticipated exactly this response, "Mr. William Mitchell specifically requested that his final wishes be shared at the annual family reunion. He felt it was important for everyone to understand his decisions and the reasoning behind them." She opened her briefcase with deliberate precision, withdrawing documents that had been prepared for exactly this moment. The will, the estate inventory, the forensic accounting reports, the evidence of systematic theft that had been building for years while Uncle Bill watched and documented and planned his response. "William Mitchell's last will and testament," Rebecca announced, holding up the official document with its raised seals and legal language, "leaves his entire estate to his niece, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, in recognition of her distinguished military service and the sacrifices she's made for her country." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of profound quiet that comes when people's understanding of reality shifts fundamentally in the span of a few seconds. Relatives who'd assumed Uncle Bill had been a modest mechanic living paycheck to paycheck were learning that he'd accumulated nearly $750,000 in assets. Family members who'd dismissed me as the odd daughter, who'd chosen an unconventional path, were discovering that I'd been singled out for recognition by the family patriarch. But Rebecca wasn't finished. Uncle Bill's instructions had been specific, detailed, designed to ensure that the full truth emerged in a way that would make denial or deflection impossible. The estate includes the family farm, 3 rental properties in Riverside, investment accounts, life insurance policies, and a detailed letter explaining Mr. Mitchell's decision, she continued, her voice steady and professional despite the growing tension in the room. In his own words, he wanted to ensure that the family member who'd served with honor and distinction would be properly recognized, especially given the financial irregularities he'd discovered regarding her personal accounts. Financial irregularities. The phrase landed like a grenade in the middle of the family gathering, its implications radiating outward in waves of shock and confusion. Elderly relatives who remembered Uncle Bill as a quiet, principled man began to understand that his final act had been far more complex than a simple bequest. Younger family members who'd heard whispers about my military service but never understood its significance were beginning to grasp that something much deeper was being revealed. My mother made a small, strangled sound, her hand flying to her throat in the same gesture of shock I'd seen in our living room months earlier. My father's face had gone completely white, his confident patriarchal presence crumbling, as he realized that Uncle Bill's posthumous testimony was about to expose everything they'd worked to conceal. David tried to interrupt, his insurance salesman instincts kicking in as he attempted damage control. "I think there's been some mistake," he said, his voice carrying the false confidence of someone trying to talk his way out of an impossible situation. "Uncle Bill never mentioned any of this to the family." "Because," Rebecca replied, producing another document from her briefcase, "he'd lost faith in the family's integrity." According to his correspondence with my office, he discovered that Sarah's relatives had been systematically stealing from her bank accounts during her military deployments. The word stealing hit the room like a physical blow. This wasn't a family dispute or a misunderstanding about financial management. This was a criminal accusation made by a dead man who'd had months to consider his words and choose them with precision. Marcus Thompson stepped forward at that moment, his military bearing and Pentagon credentials adding weight to what was already an overwhelming revelation. "I think people need to understand who Colonel Mitchell really is," he said, addressing the room with the confidence of someone who'd served alongside me in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. He spoke about our deployment together in Afghanistan, about the intelligence work I'd done that had prevented terrorist attacks and saved American lives. He described my leadership style, my dedication to the soldiers under my command, my reputation among senior officers as someone who could be trusted with the most sensitive missions. He talked about the medals I'd earned, the commendations from generals, the respect I'd gained from peers who understood the true cost of military service. Captain Park added her own testimony, describing my role in developing counterterrorism protocols that were still being used by intelligence units across multiple theaters of operation. Sergeant Major Williams spoke about my mentorship of younger officers, my commitment to ensuring that every soldier under my command returned home safely. With each testimony, with each professional accomplishment described by people who'd witnessed it firsthand, the room's understanding of my identity transformed completely. I wasn't the family disappointment who'd rejected traditional roles. I was a decorated war hero whose service had literally saved lives. I wasn't the odd daughter who'd chosen an unconventional path. I was a senior military officer whose expertise was sought by the Pentagon's senior leadership. The contrast with my family's treatment became more stark with every revelation. These were people who'd spent decades dismissing my achievements, who'd excluded me from family gatherings while stealing my money, who'd convinced themselves that military service was somehow less valuable than selling insurance or designing websites or raising children in suburban comfort. Rebecca waited for the testimonies to conclude before delivering the final blow, the piece of evidence that would make their guilt undeniable and their consequences inevitable. "The forensic accounting report," she announced, opening a thick folder filled with bank statements and transaction records, documents nearly $400,000 in unauthorized withdrawals from Colonel Mitchell's accounts over an 8-year period. The money was transferred to accounts belonging to her parents, brother, and sister, often while she was deployed in active combat zones. The numbers were devastating in their precision. Each family member's theft documented down to the penny, each unauthorized transaction dated and verified, each violation of trust cataloged with the thoroughness of a federal investigation. David's boat purchase, Jessica's private school tuition, my parents' home renovations, all funded by money stolen from someone who was risking her life in service to their country. The room erupted in whispers, shocked conversations between relatives who were struggling to process what they'd just learned. Elderly aunts and uncles who'd respected my parents for decades were discovering that their moral authority had been built on criminal behavior. Younger cousins who'd been taught to view me as the family outsider were learning that I was actually the family hero whose achievements had been systematically suppressed. My father made one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative, standing up with the commanding presence he'd cultivated over decades of community leadership. "This is a private family matter," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "These accusations are based on misunderstandings that can be resolved without involving outsiders." But Uncle Bill had anticipated this response, had planned for exactly this moment of attempted deflection. Rebecca produced one final document, a letter written in Uncle Bill's careful handwriting, addressed to the annual family reunion, and marked to be read aloud in exactly these circumstances. "To my Mitchell family," she began, reading Uncle Bill's words in a voice that carried across the silent room. "If you're hearing this letter, it means I'm gone, and the truth about Sarah's treatment has finally come to light. For years, I watched as you dismissed her achievements, excluded her from family gatherings, and treated her service to our country as if it were somehow shameful or embarrassing." The letter continued with devastating precision, Uncle Bill's quiet moral authority reaching beyond death to deliver judgment on behavior he'd witnessed and documented, but been unable to prevent while alive. He described specific incidents of rejection, specific moments when my family had chosen pride over principle, specific decisions that had revealed their true character. "Sarah has spent her adult life serving something greater than herself," the letter concluded, "while some of you have spent that same time serving only your own interests. She deserves better from the family that raised her, and since you've proven incapable of giving her the respect she's earned, I'm using my final act to ensure she receives the recognition and financial security you've denied her." The silence that followed was complete and profound. No one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed capable of processing the complete reversal of everything they'd believed about family dynamics and moral authority. The people they'd respected as community leaders had been exposed as thieves. The daughter they'd been taught to pity had been revealed as a war hero. The quiet uncle they'd barely noticed had engineered a posthumous reckoning that had destroyed decades of carefully constructed lies. I stood up slowly, my uniform pristine, my bearing calm, surrounded by colleagues who'd chosen to spend their personal time bearing witness to this moment of truth. I looked around the room at faces I'd known since childhood, relatives who'd watched me grow up and somehow failed to see who I'd become. "The money will be returned," I said quietly, my voice carrying without strain across the silent room. "All of it, plus interest, within 30 days. The legal documents have already been filed, and the court will ensure compliance whether you cooperate voluntarily or not." I paused, letting that reality settle, before delivering the final piece of Uncle Bill's justice. "As for the estate, I'll be using Uncle Bill's farm to establish a residential facility for homeless veterans. People who've served their country and found themselves forgotten by the families and communities they protected. It seems appropriate, given Uncle Bill's feelings about recognizing service and sacrifice." The irony was perfect, elegant in its moral clarity. The family that had dismissed military service would watch as their inherited wealth was transformed into a monument to military service. The relatives who'd stolen from a deployed soldier would see that money used to help other soldiers who'd been abandoned by the systems that should have protected them. I walked toward the exit, my military colleagues falling into formation beside me, leaving behind a room full of people who were finally beginning to understand the true cost of their choices. Some looked ashamed, others angry, a few seemed genuinely shocked by the revelations. But none of them tried to stop me. None of them offered the apologies that might have mattered years earlier. None of them seemed capable of acknowledging the magnitude of what they'd lost through their own small-mindedness and greed. Outside, the August sun was beginning to set, painting the Ohio countryside in shades of gold and amber that reminded me of deployments in distant countries, of sunsets viewed from forward operating bases, where young soldiers counted days until they could return to families who hopefully valued their sacrifice more than mine had valued me. Marcus walked beside me toward our cars, his presence a reminder that some families are chosen rather than inherited, that some bonds are forged in shared service rather than shared DNA. "You did the right thing," he said simply. "Uncle Bill did the right thing," I replied. "I just showed up to collect." 6 months later, the William Mitchell Veterans Residence opened on the old farm property, offering transitional housing and support services for veterans who'd fallen through society's cracks. The facility was funded by Uncle Bill's estate, managed by a board of retired military officers, and dedicated to the principle that service deserves recognition regardless of whether families choose to provide it. I never received an apology from my parents' brother or sister. The money was returned as ordered by the court, but no acknowledgement of wrongdoing accompanied the payments. They'd chosen to treat the restitution as a business transaction rather than an admission of moral failure, as if legal compliance could somehow substitute for ethical accountability. But Uncle Bill's final gift hadn't been about their redemption anyway. It had been about my recognition, about ensuring that at least one member of the Mitchell family understood that service matters, that sacrifice deserves honor, that some things are more important than social conformity and financial comfort. The farm became my refuge, a place where veterans could find the acceptance and respect that their biological families had sometimes failed to provide. I retired from active duty and took over daily management of the facility, discovering that helping others heal from family rejection was perhaps the most meaningful mission of my career. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on Uncle Bill's old porch, watching the sun set over fields where he'd taught me the difference between crops and weeds, between what grows strong and what merely takes up space. The cats still lived in the barn, fed by volunteers who understood that caring for abandoned creatures was part of the facility's mission. Sometimes former residents would visit, successful in new careers or relationships, grateful for the time and space they'd been given to rebuild their lives after service. They'd share stories about families who'd come to understand their worth, about communities that had learned to value their contributions, about finding places where their sacrifices were recognized and honored. Those were the moments when Uncle Bill's final lesson became clear. Family isn't always about blood or birth certificates or shared last names. Sometimes it's about people who choose to see your worth when others can't, who stand by you when others won't, who ensure your service is remembered even when you're not there to defend it yourself. The girl who'd left Riverside decades earlier searching for approval had finally found something better: purpose, respect, and the knowledge that some battles are worth fighting regardless of whether the people who should love you understand why you're fighting them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.